Good afternoon. How nice of you to join. Nice quiet week, not much going on, not very busy for schools. Of course, not the case. Recognise that. So it is terrific that you've managed to make the time to come. We're going in this short session to do three things. I'm going to pass to my colleague, Marc Rowland, in a minute, who's going to talk about the use of the catch-up funding that all schools have been given. And obviously how it really is intended to support children catch up. And obviously we've got added issues now of children who perhaps are going to fall further behind. And then obviously we're also going to talk about the practicalities of tutoring. I think some of you really wanted to get going. Now is the time when we really can. And we can say a little bit about that, and then we're going to open it up to questions, and then we're going to let you get on with the rest of your day. So thank you very much, Lee, for being here. Let me introduce Marc Rowland to you. Marc.
Thank you, Tim, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. So we're talking about accountability, sort of first and foremost, but of course, that means something different to different people, doesn't it? And what I want to I will talk a little bit about DFE accountability and templates, but of course, that the highest form of accountability around the catch-up premium and addressing the impact of disadvantage more broadly is our accountability to our pupils and our families. And I want to frame the first part of the talk around that. Addressing educational disadvantage is hard. It's a long-term issue, and it just got more difficult, didn't it? I don't think many people had a global pandemic in their implementation plans for addressing disadvantage this year. But I also think it's important that we remember that our disadvantaged pupils were not experiencing a level playing field, before the pandemic. So this is a long-term issue. Our students, our pupils in our school are not at risk of underachievement because they are pupil premium or indeed any other label they come with, but rather they're at risk of underachievement because of the impact of socioeconomic disadvantage on their learning over time. And that is a process. It's not an event. It's a long-term issue that in many cases starts prenatal, and therefore we need to take a long-term approach to it, rooted in the highest quality learning experiences in the classroom, supplementing that with high quality academic intervention, of which one of those approaches can be really high quality tutoring, which we're going to talk to you about, and then those wider approaches around parental involvement, attendance, and more. And of course, those things are all interrelated to each other. But what I would like to say is that the best levers for addressing educational disadvantage during and post COVID, I say optimistically, are the same as addressing educational disadvantage pre-COVID. And that is about ensuring that our disadvantaged pupils, and that is any pupil that's been impacted by, in the case of the catch-up premium, any pupil that's been impacted by the pandemic and their learning, but particularly those from less affluent backgrounds. It's about how we can support them and ensure that they're experiencing success in the classroom. What multiple studies tell us is that pupils from across the socioeconomic spectrum have been impacted by the pandemic. That's probably one of the least surprising things that you'll hear this week. But disproportionately impacted have been those from the lower socioeconomic groups, and indeed those with special educational needs. So I'm going to talk to a little bit each of these bullets. Joe, could you go to the next slide, please? This is very in keeping with those briefings, isn't it, that we see from the government. where I haven't learned to use a clicker yet. But what I want to set out for you really, and this applies to addressing educational disadvantage more broadly, but similarly around the sort of catch-up premium too. Our disadvantaged pupils are the canaries down the coal mine of our schools. When things go wrong, whether that's a pandemic or it's a struggle with recruitment and retention of teachers, it's our disadvantaged pupils that sort of come off worse. And even with relatively short-term funding, such as the catch-up premium, we need to take an evidence-informed approach that's interrelated around three key stages of planning, implementation, and evaluation. They're all interrelated and intertwined with each other. That, have we got, school culture and expectations right? There is no point in putting in place sort of academic tutoring if we don't have the highest of expectations of our disadvantaged pupils in terms of remote learning, or indeed what their experiences are in the classroom. Key to success in addressing educational inequality is assessment of need. Assessment, not assumptions about our pupils, will drive our strategies effectively. Pupil need, not labels, should inform our approaches, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But we should not be thinking about the types of activities that we undertake until we've done that robust assessment of pupil need and ensured that we have this sort of collective understanding in schools of how does disadvantage impact on pupils' learning, and that everybody recognises that they are in part responsible for it. To borrow the words of Tim, who's just sort of introduced the talk, we also need a culture in schools where everybody believes that our disadvantaged pupils can attain well, and we should always be prepared and ready for our pupils, irrespective of background, to surprise us. Always, always, always. So we need that, so that collective understanding, collective ownership of the strategy. And it's only when we've got that and that we've identified the impact of disadvantage on learning, should we be thinking about the strategies that we're going to adopt. So the key question, I think, if there's one thing that you take away from my bit today, is answering this critical question, not what are the barriers to learning for our disadvantaged pupils, but rather, what is the impact of socioeconomic disadvantage, or indeed the COVID pandemic, on our pupils' learning? This is the key question, and all good things sort of come from there. If we get this question wrong, we often end up taking sort of the wrong path. Poorly identified pupil need leads to poorly identified activity, leads to weaker outcomes, and it can really lead to sort of initiative fatigue and cynicism across school. So it's not that we need to sort of understand and be experts in particular labels, or even do strategic planning around particular labels, because we know, for example, that pupil premium label is a pretty blunt proxy for disadvantage, and we have groups of pupils that are impacted both disproportionately by the pandemic, but also broadly around long-term disadvantage that aren't eligible for the pupil premium. And it's explicit both in terms of the conditions of grant for pupil premium, but also the conditions around the catch-up premium, that it's for schools to be defining disadvantage in their community. So we don't need to be expert in any diagnostic label, and we don't need to be expert in labels that bring additional funding into school, like pupil premium. What we do need in schools to be an expert in our pupils in our school communities. we need to, and we need our teachers to be expert in that too, because if our teachers are an expert in their pupils, all good things come from there in terms of both the quality of teaching, but also academic intervention, tuition. The better we know the pupils, the better our approaches to tuition would be, but also then we can draw in those sort of pastoral approaches, for example, around social, emotional, mental health, and by being experts in our pupils. And the way we do that is through sort of rigorous sort of diagnostic assessment, both academic and pastoral, but pupil voice, listening to the views of pupils, parent voice, talking to parents, observations of our pupils' learning behaviours, sort of in the classroom, but teacher voice as well, and teacher agency is absolutely critical to this. Listen to teachers who are a critical intervention in terms of addressing sort of education inequality. But what I do think it's worth lingering here, because sort of poorly identified pupil need leads to almost that what I call the supermarket sweep approach to addressing disadvantage, where we're grabbing hold of different interventions and trying to hope that they will work. It's the Jackson Pollock approach, and we end up with more and more activity. And what I'd argue is the more activity that we take on, the less chance we have of having a long-term impact on our pupil outcomes. Now, the things that we tend to see around the impact of disadvantage on pupils' learning relate to particularly language, and the language gap. For me, the language gap is the attainment gap, particularly coupled with social and indeed geographical isolation, a pretty toxic combination, which can impact on pupils' self-esteem, self-confidence, their self-regulation skills, their participation in learning, their motivation, and to quote my research school colleague Alex Bedford, I think one of the biggest challenges for our disadvantaged pupils in our classrooms is the presumption of language. When I struggle with language comprehension, my lessons become something to get through rather than participate in. And that's where, again, sort of academic intervention, whether it's a pre-teach model or a post-teach model, can be super, super helpful for supporting the needs of our disadvantaged pupils. Just to reference sort of COVID-19 here as well, as I said at the beginning, multiple studies have shown us that that our disadvantaged pupils, and indeed those with special educational needs, have been disproportionately impacted by the partial school closures, and that sort of inconsistency and instability and insecurity, and that insecurity often runs through our less affluent families' lives, doesn't it? Whether that's income insecurity, employment insecurity, food insecurity, and so what we do in schools really matters, doesn't it? We're not, as schools, we can't solve all of society's problems, even though we're expected to sometimes, but we're not powerless on this agenda. And if we get it right in terms of focusing on what's in our gift, and that's about our pupils learning, we can do some really exciting transformational things. Just briefly back to COVID-19, we know that disadvantaged pupils and those with special educational needs found the greatest challenges. But for the most part, multiple studies show that whilst many disadvantaged pupils struggle with the digital divide, and there's some really exciting work going on with sort of mobile phone companies reducing tariffs and things like, and the provision of laptops, I think, is improving. What studies show us is that one of the biggest challenges our disadvantaged pupils faced actually was around space and environmental factors. Also, higher levels of stress and anxiety because of those sort of insecurities. But some other key things that have come up through sort of studies around the impact of partial school closures have been some of the biggest challenges our pupils faced have been around a lack of social interaction, the importance of relationships with teachers and peers, expert teacher or support staff knowledge and skills, a lack of structure, routine, a sense of belonging to something more than perhaps your social media group, structure, routine, consistency of expectations, opportunities for conversations, for discussions, and feedback on learning. So again, I think what this indicates to us is there are some great opportunities both around, the power of sort of whether it's in school learning, online learning, blended approaches, but also around academic intervention too. And really, really not understating the power of pastoral care at this sort of really, really challenging time. Our strategies to support our disadvantaged pupils and those most impacted by COVID-19 will stand or fall on the quality of the relationships that we forge with our pupils and indeed their families. I'm going to talk about families a little bit later on. And I'd really, really commend you David Osher's paper from 2017 around why relationships underpin everything that we need to do to address disadvantage. We can share a link with that to you afterwards. I know I'm doing that naughty thing where I cherry pick the evidence base to support your argument, but I'd really, really sort of commend that approach to you, which is why accountability matters around the catch-up premium, because we won't address the impact of COVID-19 on pupils' learning through ratcheting up accountability and telling people what they have to do. It's for schools who are best placed to determine that. And as to borrow Tim's words again, when we tell people what they have to do, we actually absolve people of accountability. You can say, well, Marc Rowland told me to do this, or the DFE told me to do this. We absolve ourselves of responsibility. The highest form of accountability we have is to our pupils. And indeed their families, and that's why we need to own that and build relationships with them to help them and support to address the impact of disadvantage. Thank you, Joe. So what we wanted to do is provide, it's a template around this agenda to support your work, and there's sort of nothing sort of magical about this work, but I hope it's helpful to you. I mean, it sets out, based on the sort of the DFE expectations around the catch-up premium, reporting mechanisms, and some links to some guidance reports. And the evidence review from the Education Endowment Foundation, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. I'm not going to spend and waste your time reading things to you that you can easily get from one page on the sort of DFE website. But I think what we've tried to do here is sort of draw it all together for you. And what we're going to do is provide you with a worked example, and it's an example, not an exemplar, that can hopefully help your thinking. Thank you, Jay. So this is an example of a school, an academy that that we work very, very closely with, and they've set out their priorities for the academic year. And what I'd say again is that point around assessment, not assumptions. Pupils need to drive the activity. More than ever, within short-term funding, we need to resist the temptation of rushing into activity. I talked to some colleagues in the Southeast about the catch-up premium a couple of weeks ago, secondary heads, and a colleague said to me, look, I haven't got the time to do the assessments that you're talking about because the money sort of might run out. But we really, really have to think carefully about that. And I really, really recognize that challenge within all the other challenges that are going on within school. But we need to be wary of remembering that activity does not equate to impact. Curriculum coverage is a poor proxy for learning. And we need to really, really avoid the rush to activity. One of the reasons more generally that pupil premium hasn't had the impact that we'd like it to have been done over time is that we've sometimes focused on the accountability rather than to sort of DFE to Ofsted rather than accountability to pupils and families. So we've done things that are easy to evidence that we've done them rather than things that we know will make a difference to pupils in the long term. So here we've got three five priorities across teaching and learning, academic intervention, and wider approaches. Now, in normal, sort of more benign times, if we were talking about addressing education inequality, we would probably want to see a much greater weighting, on teaching and learning, and less on academic intervention. But by the nature of this funding and the acute issues arising from the pandemic, I think it's absolutely right and proper that we see a greater focus on that sort of academic intervention to enable pupils to, I'm not sure the word sort of catch up, but what's critical, isn't it, is that all of our pupils, irrespective of background and barrier to learning, feel like they belong in our classrooms. The best way to raise the pupils' self-confidence, self-esteem, or aspirations is for them to feel like they belong into experiencing success in the classroom. And that's why the pastoral element of there is super important, recognizing that different pupils and different families have experienced different, have very different experiences through the pandemic. So that that support there to enable pupils to be in the right place for learning is super important. But of course, that needs to be coupled. There's no point in working with a pupil's social emotional learning outside of the classroom if that isn't backed up by what happens to them in the classroom. Anyway, and so these things are all interrelated, and that's absolutely critical. So we see some additional HLTA hours there to support pupils in the classroom. I think there's a really important point here about staff well-being. We need our teachers. I think it's a Woody Allen thing about sort of, is it 90% of success is turning up. Our teachers' well-being is absolutely critical to addressing the impact of COVID-19. So we need to manage this and our expectations sort of carefully, which brings us nicely to tuition, which when done well, and Izzy will talk you through this in a little while, will be supplementing high quality teaching rather than being a replacement for it. And we know, of course, teachers are best placed to address the impact of education inequality, education disadvantage, but there are only so many hours in the day, aren't there? Within a challenging situation that we find ourselves in. So that high quality evidence-based tuition model can supplement pupils' experiences in the classroom, and we've got a range of interventions there based on different key stages and in different pupil need. For those of you who are not familiar with NELI, the Nuffield Early Language Intervention, it's one I think that we all should be super excited about, around early intervention that addresses pupil need, that's showing, through multiple studies to be showing a really strong effect size too. So you've got a range of strategies impacting on a range of different pupils there. Of course, they're interrelated. Thank you, Joe. So look, here are these sort of in a little bit more detail. Of course, I've talked to you about these around why they matter for pupils. But what each of these slides, and I won't linger on them because I want time for Izzy to come in. And I think those of you might know me, time keeping it isn't always my best strength, and I talk far too much. But what this shows, this monitoring, implementation, evaluation section shows how it's almost our theory of change. What's our priority and what's the activity that's going to address that? Why are we doing it? And it shows obviously the key stage that we're focusing on there. Okay, thank you, Joe. Here are second priorities. Here is the tutoring model for younger pupils with an impact evaluation framework here, and a little bit more detail on NELI too. And then those fourth and fifth priorities, the HLTAs to support sort of flexible teaching, the importance of a familiar face around cover. It's one of the things that we increasingly hear in schools that are really successful in addressing educational disadvantages, is a commitment to no cover. And that's not to belittle the work of classroom supply teachers. I think it's one of the most hard, difficult jobs in education. But that acknowledgement, as per David Osher's paper, the importance of relationships being consistent, and underpinning that is the ELSA work. And again, just to sort of labour the point and be a clanging cymbal again, you know, when we look through the example that we've given them, the sort of mortar between those bricks needs to be the role of the senior leadership team, you know, ensuring the effective execution of those plans. The link between the tutoring, the HLTA, and the class teacher is fundamental. And misquoting my colleague Jonathan Sharples, who wrote the EF implementation guidance here, we've got to be wary of the launch and pray approach to catch-up funding. The fact that we've launched it and put some resource behind it doesn't mean that it might be working in the way that we'd like it to. So that quality assurance element of it needs to be there. And that quality assurance, that impact evaluation, that process evaluation sort of activity is fundamental to better outcomes for our pupils, which is what we're all about. And just really briefly here, I just want to talk a little bit about families, you know, and particularly those sort of from the least affluent backgrounds. I'm not going to talk through, you can read it yourselves, but this is work by Jill Main from the University of Leeds in 2018, pre-pandemic, that I think, you know, I've read this so many times, but it still makes me wince when I do read it, around a fascinating, you know, and really uncomfortable insight into life on the margins. Yeah. And I think our strategies for addressing educational inequality, both long-term and short-term, are far more effective if we see and understand life through the lens of our least affluent families, because, you know, life is tough, isn't it, on those sort of very, very, very low incomes. And again, what we need to do to address educational disadvantage effectively is understand how it impacts on pupils' learning. Thank you, Joe. So I'm going to hand over to my super colleague, Izzy now, who's going to talk to you about, you know, part of what might be the academic intervention approach around how we can support pupils through tuition. So thank you, Izzy.
Thank you, Mark, and good afternoon, everybody. So I'm not going to repeat all of the points that Mark has made, but I will summarise some of them. I'll start by just outlining our approach and our preferred model for the delivery of tuition, and that has been that it's preferably a face-to-face tuition delivered by tutors that have been recommended to SP tutors by schools. And the reason that we have opted for that as our preferred method is the obvious benefits of existing relationships within schools, with between staff members, between staff and pupils, and any existing relationships that are already with the parents. Obviously, that isn't our only method, which is one of our preferred methods. As far as the lockdown goes, that obviously changes the landscape of that somewhat, and which is one of the reasons for changing the focus of this webinar. That face-to-face is not impossible, and also not undesirable. However, it is more tricky, with more people shielding, and schools obviously not wanting too many people in and out of their doors, and certainly not over and above what is absolutely necessary. But we've sat back and considered really carefully what tutoring could and should look like during the lockdown, and how actually tutoring could contribute to mitigate some of the problems that schools may find delivering learning to pupils from a distance. So I'll just lots of them cross over with, if not all of them, cross over with what Marc has said. So like him, I won't labour the point too much, but I just want to draw out some of those for you. So obviously there is a great advantage of the continuity of providing continuity of learning for pupils. So those pupils that are in most need of extra support will receive additional structured learning and sustained opportunity at a suitable frequency from the same tutor. And as tutors are expected to align their tutoring with what's going on in the classroom, whether that's in the classroom on site or the remote classroom, they can maintain that whilst pupils are learning from either remotely or indeed, as some of them still are, in school, or actually a mix of these, which is probably the most likely of the three. And also, tutors can start from the point at which schools have assessed where those pupils are, and then build that learning towards achieving the expected outcomes of the tutoring block. Following on from that, there's obviously the whole of the structure of the learning, and tutors can provide a really, really robust structured approach focused specifically on the needs of those the small number of pupils with the 1-to-3 ratio from pupils to tutor. And that obviously supplements what goes on with the teaching from either the class teacher or the subject teacher, and it strengthens the pupils' relationships with learning to ensure that pupils are able to succeed in their home environment as well as on site in school. There's a really interesting EEF study, a project that's been taking place, and there's a summary of that on the EEF website, which is looks at online tuition and the evidence behind the advantages of that for disadvantaged pupils and how they benefit from that. And one of the quotations that is in there is that the relationship that students built up over the programme meant that they were engaged and keen to participate each week. There are another number of others quotes from that survey too, such as 9 in 10 children say tutoring helps them feel more confident with their schoolwork, and children say what they particularly like about tutoring is the one-to-one support for issues they're struggling with, the reduced fear of peer judgment, and the flexibility to learn at their own pace. Now, Marc picked up on that feeling of community in the classroom, but if you can build that and develop that before they are or as they are in that situation, that can only help to strengthen the community whilst they're in the classroom or online classroom. Tutoring can also, and structured approach to tutoring can also help with self-regulation. I know Marc mentioned that already, and work ethic, which they can bring back with them when they return from lockdown, and it can instill positive learning habits, especially for those that haven't got those embedded yet. Because the small groups can not only focus on the subjects and the content, but they can also really hone in on the skills of learning on top of the subject-specific aims. So that kind of all feeds into improving pupil confidence and self-esteem, which we all know is one of the foundations for successful learning. And it also, one of the things that Marc and I were talking about yesterday actually was that the building of self-esteem comes from the demonstration that the school has faith in those pupils and they're important enough to be invested in, and demonstrating that their learning and their progress is important to everybody. There's also the opportunities to use tutoring as an additional homeschool link. It's kind of a window into what's going on at home, and part of the week that pupil is doing exactly what they need to be doing, guided in a small group by a tutor. It also gives a parent opportunity, because one of the safeguarding procedures that for certainly the younger pupils is that a parent or somebody, an adult, is in the room with them whilst they're doing their tutoring. And of course, when somebody's in the room, you can't help but listen to what's going on, and offers an opportunity for parents to engage in their children's learning. Finally, Marc has mentioned this already, but worth mentioning again, certainly, that it's such a stressful time for everybody trying to provide learning and to pupils and to improve their progress. So tutoring is an excellent way of adding capacity to schools, so teachers can be supported. That will obviously help to look after their well-being. Although tutoring does supplement teaching rather than replacing it, it does mean that there's an extra pair of hands on delivering learning, an extra pair of eyes on assessment, and an extra voice in the feedback for the pupils and for parents too. Now, we would like to go to a question and answer session. Tim, do you want to come back in here?
As you know, Izzy, I answer the easy questions and you answer the difficult questions. So we're going to ask you to use the chat to put in questions, and we'll can take sort of like 30 seconds pause. If you've got a question, put it in there, and then we will look to try to answer it in the next few minutes. So let's just take sort of a few seconds pause, and then we'll come back to any questions you've got in just a second. We really want this program to be useful to you. We know it's your program. Mark, if you want Mark's exemplification and template, write into us and we'll send it to you, or we'll put it on the website the next day or so. If you have any problems, contact Izzy and her team, and they will do their very best to sort it out. Can we thank you very much indeed for coming this afternoon, and to wish you really well in your work during these really tricky times.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you.